The music swelled as the cathedral doors opened, and there she was, Olivia, my younger sister, walking down the aisle in the custom Vera Wang dress I had chosen. The dress I'd flown to Paris for. The dress I was supposed to wear in front of 200 guests, family, and colleagues, under these very same arches. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like every bride should be. Except this wasn't her wedding. Not originally. This was mine. I stood silently at the back of St. Patrick's Cathedral, the cold marble beneath my heels grounding me more than I cared to admit. My hands were steady, my heart not so much. I watched James Whitman, once my fiancé, standing at the altar with that polished grin, as if nothing about this moment was borrowed. But it was. All of it. The venue, the flowers, the music, the guest list. Even the menu. They'd kept everything. 2 months ago, I was planning this day down to the last detail. Then I came home early from a medical conference in San Francisco to find James and Olivia together in the penthouse apartment we had bought for our future. He didn't even pretend to be ashamed. It just happened, he had said, his arm casually draped across Olivia's shoulders. We didn't plan it. No remorse. Just logistics. What followed felt like a fever dream. James had insisted that he and Olivia go ahead with the wedding plans. It makes sense financially, he'd said, as if explaining a corporate acquisition. The deposits are non-refundable. Olivia loves all your choices anyway. He said it like it was a favor to me. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I packed a single suitcase and walked out without a word. I left the apartment, the plans, the life we were building. And then I disappeared into a suite at the Whitby Hotel and told my hospital I was taking a temporary leave. I needed time, I said. What I didn't say was that I wasn't planning to heal. I was planning to understand. Because James wasn't just rich, he was methodical. And 6 months earlier, he'd had me sign a prenuptial agreement. His idea, his lawyers, his terms. And I'd agreed. Not because I had to, but because I respected the idea of protecting what mattered. But James forgot something. I'm a surgeon. I don't overlook details. And I don't leave things unfinished. The prenup had been one of those awkward but necessary conversations, back when I still thought we were building a life based on mutual respect. James came from old money, his family name was etched into libraries and hospital wings across Manhattan. It's just a formality, he'd said over a glass of Barolo, sliding the papers across the table like a contract he expected me to sign without reading. You understand, right? My father would never forgive me if I didn't. I had nodded at the time, too tired from a 12-hour surgery shift to argue. But I didn't sign anything that night. I took the documents to my own attorney the next morning. What James didn't know was that my family had its own history of protecting assets, less grand, more practical. My grandfather had been a Depression-era banker. My father, a cautious accountant. I'd grown up understanding the value of reading the fine print. So my attorney, a quiet woman named Miriam Klein, had combed through the prenup meticulously. There's a full disclosure clause, Miriam told me. It states that both parties must provide complete financial transparency. Any undisclosed assets could render this agreement invalid. At the time, I had nothing to hide. My finances were straightforward, savings, my 401k, a few modest investments. But James? His portfolio spanned 6 countries and at least 4 different holding companies. He'd handed over a glossy binder of documents that I suspected he didn't compile himself. It looked impressive, but I had my doubts even then. I remember stumbling across a folder in his home office drawer 3 months before the wedding. It wasn't hidden, just buried under a stack of real estate brochures. Inside was a printout of a wire transfer to an account in the Cayman Islands. The name on it wasn't his, but the signature was unmistakably James's. At the time, I had assumed it was part of a trust, something boring and tax-related. I told myself I'd ask him about it after the honeymoon. I never got the chance. After everything fell apart, that image burned itself into my memory. So when I found myself alone in that hotel suite, I pulled up the prenup on my laptop and called Miriam. If James failed to disclose an offshore account, I asked her, what does that mean? It means, she said slowly, that the entire agreement could be thrown out. Especially if that account contains funds tied to anything questionable. I could hear her typing in the background. Do you remember the account name? I did. And once I gave it to her, she got to work. What followed was a meticulous, clinical process, just like surgery. While the rest of my family was awkwardly tiptoeing around the new couple and pretending I was on a silent retreat, I was assembling a case file. Wire transfers. Beneficiary records. A secondary email address James had used for private communications. By the end of week 3, we had confirmation, over $12 million, spread across 3 offshore accounts, none of which were included in his disclosure documents. And then we found something else. A series of high-volume trades made through one of those shell companies, timed suspiciously close to announcements from 2 pharmaceutical firms James's bank had been advising. Insider trading. It was enough to make the SEC salivate. But I wasn't interested in headlines. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was preparing for a reckoning. And I knew exactly when it would happen. Not in court. Not through lawyers. It would happen under chandeliers, over champagne, in front of everyone who mattered to him. At the wedding reception. The reception was held at the Whitmore Ballroom, a glittering glass and marble monument in the Upper East Side, drenched in candlelight and subtle floral scent. I had chosen it nearly a year ago for its elegance, its light, its ability to make everything feel like a dream. And now I was walking into it, not as a bride, but as a guest. People turned as I entered, though they tried to be discreet. Some smiled sympathetically. Others whispered behind their champagne flutes. The Reynolds girl. The jilted one. The sister. I gave them nothing. Just a polite nod, my heels echoing against polished floors, my expression unreadable. James didn't see me at first. He was too busy basking in the crowd, hand in hand with Olivia. Posing for the photographer like this was the culmination of something noble, not stolen. Olivia looked radiant. I couldn't deny it. But there was a certain tightness around her smile, something forced beneath the layers of makeup and borrowed perfection. I found my table, sat quietly, and waited. The meal passed slowly. I barely touched the food. I didn't need to eat. I had something else planned. When the champagne was poured and the toasts began, I could feel it, my moment drawing near. Olivia's best friend gave a shaky speech. James's college roommate tried too hard to be funny. Then the MC, with his practiced charm, invited anyone else who wished to speak. I stood. The room hushed as my chair scraped softly against the floor. Every head turned. Olivia froze mid-sip. James straightened in his seat. I walked to the front, heels clicking like a metronome of inevitability. The MC offered me the mic with a nervous smile. I took it gently, turned to face the guests, and raised my glass. To James and Olivia, I began, my voice steady, cool. May your marriage be built on honesty, something your relationship has lacked from the very beginning. A murmur swept the room like a sharp wind through a chapel. Olivia blinked rapidly. James's expression faltered. I continued, calm as ever. When James and I were engaged, he insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Which I signed. Without hesitation. He said it was to protect his family's legacy. I understood. I set my glass down. What he didn't know, I said, holding up a slim black folder, is that full disclosure was a requirement for that prenup to remain valid. Any hidden assets? Any undisclosed accounts? It voids the entire agreement. I walked toward the head table. James had gone pale. You forgot about the Cayman accounts, James. The ones under the Sandro Trust. The ones holding $12 million. You also forgot that your trades, timed conveniently before biotech announcements, leave a trail. One the SEC is very interested in. I placed the folder in front of him. Slowly. Deliberately. That's a copy of what I've already submitted to the authorities. They're waiting outside. Gasps now. A few guests had stood. Olivia looked between me and James, her lips parted, face draining of color. And Olivia, I turned to her, my voice softening, just slightly. I forgive you. She looked stunned. Lost. One day, you'll realize this wasn't about me punishing you. This was about saving you from a man who betrays quietly, strategically, and always for his own gain. He didn't just do this to me. He would have done it to you too. Security had begun moving discreetly through the crowd at James's table. He stood abruptly, whispering something to his lawyer seated nearby, but it was too late. I set the mic down without another word. Then, I walked away from the wreckage he had created. Calm. Exact. Complete. Outside the ballroom, the autumn air hit me like a baptism, crisp, honest, cutting through the last of the adrenaline. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I simply stepped out onto the sidewalk, past the silent row of black cars idling under the marquee, and kept walking. Inside, chaos had erupted. I could hear it faintly, raised voices, chairs scraping, someone crying. But that was no longer my world. I had severed my last tie to it. A town car was waiting for me at the corner. I'd scheduled it for 9:45, assuming it would take no more than 5 minutes to deliver the blow. I got in silently, gave the driver my address, and leaned back against the leather seat. I took a breath. And for the first time in weeks, I exhaled without shaking. The next morning, my phone was flooded. Missed calls. Voicemails. Texts. A few from guests I barely remembered, congratulatory in tone, saying things like iconic, legendary, he had it coming. A few from family members, some too stunned to speak. One from Olivia, just 3 words, how could you? I didn't respond. Let her sit in the mess. Let her look James in the eyes now, really look, and see who she'd fought to defend. She had 2 choices now, stay and unravel alongside him, or get out before the consequences reached her too. She chose the latter. By the end of the week, she'd filed for annulment. My parents told me in a quiet, humiliated phone call that she'd returned to Boston to stay with an old college friend. She's broken, my mother had said. But she's starting to understand. I felt no satisfaction in that. What I felt was something colder, resolution. Meanwhile, the authorities had acted swiftly. The SEC had already flagged some of James's trading patterns in their quarterly sweep, but my evidence fast-tracked their case. Insider trading was always hard to prove, but not when a jilted ex hands over wire transfers, shadow company records, and communication logs with precise dates and annotated footnotes. He was issued a formal inquiry within days. His company placed him on immediate suspension. And within 3 weeks, James Whitman's face was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, right next to words like federal investigation and permanent ban from the securities industry. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I went back to work. Surgery demands your full attention. It doesn't care about your heartbreak. It doesn't wait for your healing. It demands precision, presence, purpose. I needed all 3. So I gave myself to it, fully. No more distractions. No more grief masquerading as strength. Just the quiet confidence of a woman who had survived something vile and come through cleaner on the other side. 6 months passed. I redesigned my office. I spoke at a national cardiac summit. I cut my hair. I said no to things that didn't serve me. I said yes to things that did. And one Tuesday morning, while reviewing a patient's pre-op scans, a news alert lit up my phone. James Whitman settles with SEC, fined $9.7 million, banned for life from securities practice. I stared at the headline for a moment. Then I turned off the screen, stood up, and walked into surgery. Steady hands. Clear mind. Full heart. There was nothing left to fix but lives. A week after the settlement hit the news, I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real, handwritten letter, pressed cream paper, Olivia's script unmistakable even after all these months. It began with a single line. I don't know what hurts more, what I did to you, or what I let him do to me. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't try to explain. She wrote about how, at first, James made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced before. How he talked to her like she was brilliant, important, irreplaceable. He made me feel like I wasn't just her shadow anymore, she wrote. I didn't realize he was using my resentment like currency. She described the weeks after the wedding, how the illusion unraveled quickly. How James became cold, distracted, paranoid. How she began to notice the cracks I once ignored, the half-truths, the manipulation, the quiet cruelty delivered under the guise of logic. But the part that stayed with me most was this. You didn't ruin our wedding, Emma. You rescued me from it. From him. From myself. I didn't cry. I read it 3 times and folded it gently back into the envelope. Then I set it on the windowsill of my apartment and left it there, beside the aloe plant that somehow kept growing no matter how little I watered it. 3 days later, my mother called. She wants to come for Christmas, she said gently. She's asked to stay with us. Not in your old room. She knows better. But, she's trying. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rim of my coffee cup. She's your sister, Mom added, her voice cautious, tired. I know, I said. And I did. I said yes. Not because everything was healed. Not because I was ready. But because rebuilding isn't a moment. It's 100 small, imperfect choices made in the direction of grace. When Olivia arrived for Christmas Eve dinner, she looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just dimmer somehow. She wore no makeup, carried a simple tote, and offered no dramatic apologies. She just hugged my mother tightly, nodded politely at my father, and turned to me with a question in her eyes. I nodded once. She exhaled. The evening passed quietly. No one brought up the wedding, the fallout, the SEC, or the headlines. We talked about childhood memories, the casseroles we still hated, and a cheesy holiday movie playing softly in the background. Olivia barely spoke. But she stayed. And she helped wash dishes. As she handed me a towel, she finally said, I don't expect you to trust me again. I didn't answer right away. I dried a plate, set it down. I don't know if I ever will, I said honestly. But I do want to get to know the version of you that wrote that letter. She nodded, eyes glassy but dry. I want to get to know her too. That night, as I walked back to my apartment, the city was blanketed in that rare, perfect snowfall, quiet, soft, forgiving. For the first time since that morning in St. Patrick's Cathedral, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything had been fixed. But because I was finally free of the version of my life I had once planned, and ready to embrace the one I was choosing. On my own. With open eyes. And a very steady hand. Spring arrived quietly. There were no grand announcements, no cinematic rebirths. Just longer days, softer air, and the kind of silence that didn't sting anymore. I filled my life with structure and purpose, early morning runs along Riverside, surgery rotations that left me both exhausted and fulfilled, quiet dinners with colleagues who didn't tiptoe around my past. But healing, as I learned, isn't just forward motion. Sometimes, it's standing still long enough to let the pain pass through you without bracing. One Saturday afternoon, I was sitting in a sunlit corner of my favorite cafe, catching up on journal articles, when someone slid into the seat across from me. It was Miriam, my attorney. She wore her usual dark blazer, but her smile was unusually warm. You've been hard to reach, she said. I've been busy, I replied. In the best way. She pulled out a small folder from her bag. I thought you'd like to know, Whitman's final hearing concluded last week. The SEC settlement held. But there's more. I set my coffee down. More? She nodded. Turns out, one of the companies he traded against is pressing civil charges for breach of fiduciary duty. Class action style. He could be facing additional penalties. And prison? Maybe, she said. But either way, he's done. I didn't feel the rush I expected. No vindication. No spark of vengeance. Just stillness. Like watching the tide go out after a long storm. Miriam hesitated, then added, his legal team quietly reached out last month. Wanted to know if you'd sign a confidentiality clause in exchange for a substantial payout. To make it all disappear. I raised an eyebrow. And? I told them no. That you don't take hush money for the truth. I smiled for the first time that day. Good. She closed the folder and leaned back. You never once asked for more than justice, Emma. That's rare. It wasn't about punishing him, I said. It was about refusing to let him rewrite the story. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment, watching the lights of the city shimmer against the river. Below me, the world moved on, cars, laughter, late-night joggers, lives untouched by the names that once haunted mine. I checked my phone. One new message. Olivia, dinner next week? Just us? I understand if not. But I'd like to try. I stared at it for a long time. Then typed, okay. Tuesday. No white wine. Her reply came instantly, read only. No Vera Wang either. I laughed. Out loud. Alone. Not because things were perfect. But because the cracks had finally stopped spreading. And the woman looking back at me in the window wasn't someone shattered anymore. She was someone whole, wiser, quieter, and entirely her own. Summer in New York is a strange kind of honest, hot, sticky, impossible to ignore. The kind of season that doesn't let you hide. It makes you feel everything. The air is heavy, the streets are alive, and time, somehow, moves slower. And that was exactly how I wanted it. 3 months after Olivia and I sat across from each other in a quiet West Village restaurant, awkward, cautious, and painfully sincere, we'd settled into something resembling a fragile truce. Not a full sisterhood. Not yet. But something real. Something earned. She'd moved back to the city on her own terms. Found a job at an interior design firm, rented a modest walk-up in Gramercy. The kind of life not borrowed from anyone. She didn't talk about James, and I never asked. Sometimes rebuilding isn't about picking up pieces, it's about throwing the old ones away and choosing something different altogether. One Friday evening, we met at a rooftop bar overlooking the Hudson. It was her idea. She was glowing in that way people do when they've finally stopped pretending. She raised her glass, club soda with lime, and said, to starting over. I tapped mine against hers. To starting better. That weekend, I flew to Boston for a surgical conference and delivered a keynote on cardiac tissue recovery after trauma. As I stood behind the podium, looking out over a sea of white coats and eager residents, I realized, I was no longer speaking from theory. I was recovery. When I returned to the hospital on Monday, a small envelope waited on my desk. No return address, just my name in familiar script. Inside was a final notice from the SEC. James had agreed to the full lifetime ban. He'd settled the civil lawsuit. No appeal. No fanfare. I folded the letter once, carefully, and tucked it into a drawer beside the surgical gloves and trauma shears. Later that afternoon, my chief of surgery stopped me in the hallway. We're expanding, she said, eyes bright. New hybrid or, bigger team. We need someone to lead it. Someone precise. Someone calm under fire. I didn't have to think. I'm ready. Because I was. Not just ready to lead. Ready to live, on my terms, no shadows, no borrowed futures, no silence mistaken for consent. That night, I walked home slowly, past the cathedral where it had all come undone. The doors were closed. The building dark. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I smiled, just a small one, as I passed. He took my wedding. She took my dress. But I kept the truth. And in the end, the truth gave me something neither of them ever had. A clean heart. And a life I built with nothing stolen, nothing borrowed, only earned. And that's how I learned that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's strategy. And the loudest revenge is the truth. What would you have done if your sister wore your dress and your fiancé wore a lie? Tell me in the comments, like this if you felt that justice, and share it with someone who believes karma wears heels.